Hello, everyone. I'm Sammy Heisero, and welcome to my poetry podcast. Today, together, we are going to explore For Want of Water by Sasha Pimentel. This poem immerses us in physical, emotional, and environmental realities of scarcity, whether that is of water, like in the title, or sanctuary itself. During this episode, I'm going to introduce the author, recite the poem, reflect on where it landed in my body and my mind, discuss the setting and the poet's choices, and unpack truths I believe the poem author offers, as well as connecting it to my own perspective and values. So I'm very excited. Let's unpack this. First of all, I always believe that a poet's life is equally as important as the work they put out and almost speaks more than the poem itself and provides a lot of context. So I'm going to give a little background on our poet, Sasha Pimentel. Pimentel was born in Manila and raised partly in the US and Saudi Arabia. She is an accomplished poet and associate professor of creative writing at the University of Texas at El Paso. Her work often explores borders, whether that is geographic, cultural, and linguistic, as well as migration, displacement, and the body in transit and transportation. Pimentel has received numerous honors, including the National Poetry Series selection for the poem we're going to talk about, For Want of Water, and the American Book Award for Insides She Swallowed. Her poems frequently appear in many prestigious outlets, such as American Poetry Review. So yeah, this is a very acclaimed poet that we are going to be discussing. And understanding her background, especially living and teaching at the US-Mexico border, it sheds light on her themes of scarcity, thirst, and movement, and For Want of Water, because it discusses that border literally, but also the metaphorical meanings behind it. So I think it's very important that she lived this herself. And it helps explain her use of like that vivid imagery, metaphor, and attention to form, because it all came from experience. So acknowledging Pimentel's life adds depth to how we interpret the poem's focus on bodies, the environment, and survival, and connects our emotional and bodily responses to her poetic perspective of things. All right, and now for the reading. Let's introduce this poem. An ant will drown himself, his body submerging into ease, his mandibles, head, antennae baptized. How lovely to lose your senses to the cup of your want. A boy drags his his mother's body across the desert, her fluids rising to God in order to quench her skin. How divine her body must have looked, clutched at the ankles, her arms reaching out in exultation, her head stippled in rings of sand and blood as he walked with her, slowly, her fallen and moving shape the fork of a divining rod, her body shaking with each of his steps, and for water, shaking to find that deep and secret tributary. I have dreams of letting go of water, of waking my lover to a bed of my urine, as my brother did to me, his thin limbs shaking to discover the shame of his inside self. And what did we know that to have an inside wet enough to free was luxury? The boy walks with his mother. He is only 13, the age I learned to stroke on the toilet the blood off my fingers, and he cannot cry, because to cry would mean the weights of his own wetness. To cry would mean to stop, to think, to differentiate the liquids moving down his face. To cry would mean to cry, so he goes on, and this is a common story. The boy is not a boy now, but every boy we have ever known. People find him. They help him to lift his mother onto their hands, their necks. They lift her to their own dark and desperate dryness. And they make it, yes, when they make it over the border to a mall parking lot, they lay her down. They fall with her body as a clump of bodies behind a city dumpster, and people make calls from behind windows. Not to the immigrants with the dying core, but to the police, who come with their handcuffs and call her dead. To call her would be to give her life a name. Roundless to where there are now only angles. To call would be to remember all the other times that he has called for her. And the boy plugs his ears, shakes his head, doesn't know that he cannot physically produce tears anymore. Such thirst can rid us of these symbols. Only that now there are mouths around him calling other names, as men run and other men give chase. Because how much do you need to give up in order to stay? A boy, a mother, your land and inner land, nothing. Nothing can be given, and he will remember nothing as he sits in a cell waiting for his sister to come to release him from his cellular pain. He will only remember water, that want for the clouds to let go their rain, and how seeing them dropping, he kept pulling forward, their bodies steady toward that dark, uneven line. Wow! That poem is very deep, for sure. When I first read it, I could feel all of the ups and downs in my own body. When I first heard the line, "An ant will drown himself, his body submerging into ease," like the very first line, I already felt like a heaviness in my chest, like the weight of the ant's surrender almost sank into me. I felt my throat tightening at the word body submerging, because that is a very deep, scary subject. The image of loss and surrender becomes like almost visceral in my body. Another thing at the line, "A boy drags his mother across the desert," I felt a tension in my shoulders and my arms. I could almost feel the strain of a little boy having to carry his mother, whether that's emotional and physical strain. My palms felt dry. That line definitely made me aware of the physical burden and like desert heat in a bodily way. When the poem asks, "What did we know that to have an inside wet enough to free was luxury?" I felt a flash of memory in my own body, a subtle like emptiness, like a dry, hollow. It made me realize like what it felt to have kind of like wetness, life inside. I don't know. Overall, the poem made me feel uneasy. I didn't really know what to think when I first read it. I hardly even understood it. It took a lot more like analyzing and going through all of the emotions that I felt myself to really be able to analyze it like I'm about to do. But yeah, I definitely did feel that physical dryness in my body. I mean, the poem is called For Want of Water. So the world of this poem, if we're talking about setting, sits in a desert landscape of metaphor and reality. Across the desert, fluids rising, want for water, the title, they all point to a very dry and hot habitat. The mention of a boy dragging his mother across the desert suggests both a physical location, but also a metaphorical crossing of boundaries. After all, it takes place around a border, which can be literal and figurative. The poem hovers in a time that is present, but can also be timeless as well. Like drought, migration, and survival are things that we see all the time and are always plaguing people around us. So with that being said, the poet uses tons of literary and rhetorical devices to convey her message and to give everyone the feelings that we feel when we read the poem. So for example, I saw a lot of imagery, of course, in that first line, "An ant will drown himself, his body submerging into ease." The ant image, the submersion, it's kind of like there's also an ease drowning juxtaposition in there. And that gives an effect of like a very vivid, unsettling vision. We see life surrendering. So it makes us think about death, life and death. It also sets a tone of water, which is talked about a lot and brought up a lot throughout the book. Metaphors and simile are also used a lot. For example, her fluids rising to God in order to quench her skin. The mother's body is like a metaphor of an offering almost to God. It makes the body seen as like to be seen as a landscape, as sacred and as vulnerable. So it merges physical suffering and then also like that spiritual invocation. Another device that was used was diction and word choice. There's a lot of repetition. We hear things about water a lot, but there's also words like drown, submerge, desert, all this stuff. And it makes us kind of feel that like sharp and like high stakes language. I kind of felt like I was on the edge of my seat the entire time I was reading the poem. And it also talks a lot about dryness versus wetness, that thirst versus fulfillment. So it definitely emphasizes the theme of like deprivation and the value of what we don't have. All right, and then lastly, another thing that I noticed was a lot of symbolism. So wetness, water, migration, desert. Water is a symbol of life, of memory, of freedom. The desert is a symbol of like absence and of boundary and of death, and those definitely contrast each other a lot throughout the poem. So it goes beyond literal thirst, like being in a desert, to many layers. So we want water not just physically, but also like emotionally and physically. So I think that Sasha's poem conveys many truths about society and the effects of violence, addiction, and literal and metaphorical thirst that we see every day. One truth that I believe the poem conveys is that having fluid or having water is a luxury. The line, "What did we know that to have an inside wet enough to free was luxury," shows us that what many people take advantage or for granted, which is wetness inside or the ability to cry or the ability to have water, something that I definitely take for granted every day, is not universal. Not everyone has that. Another truth was bodies carry the burden of the environment, of politics, of migration and survival. The boy dragging his mother, the desert crossing, the fluids rising to God, it all shows the toll that it takes on the body and how like we physically feel that suffering that comes from whether it's like the government or just lack of resources and things like that. When I read the poem, I was like, there is no way there's any lightness in this. It has a very, very dark tone to it. It took me a while to search for it, but I eventually did find some hints of light. Despite the very heavy subject, the poem does hold like odd moments of beauty. The initial image of the ant baptized, or the poetic way fluids and wetness rising up are described. It's almost like a sacrifice to God. That's the way it's portrayed. These little moments of beauty, far between, help balance the tension and make the harshness more like happily emotional. They make the reader pause and reflect and feel the weight more deeply, whether or instead of just kind of being sad. So let's talk about audience a little bit. The audience of this poem seems to include people who are willing to witness suffering, migration, and scarcity, or already have, not just in like a distant way, but in their bodies as well. I mean, we can really feel it. It definitely appeals to people who understand darkness and have experience with either physical borders like immigrants themselves or mental borders. The poem speaks to empathetic readers for sure, to those who are aware of borders, or hopefully are going to become more aware of borders, or who know, what it's like to have what you have taken. Values that I found in the audience include compassion, awareness of human cost, and recognition of what is lost when either literal or metaphorical water is not there. For me, this poem resonated a lot because I've felt dryness. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm from Phoenix. All of us here have experienced the desert, the dryness, and have seen suffering firsthand, whether it's just on the streets or hearing about droughts and things like that. I have seen heat, thirst, and emotional distance, all of which are conveyed in this poem. Reading it connected a lot to my awareness of migration and bodies in transit. So, for example, the image of the boy and his mother made me reflect on mobility and sacrifice and the weight of leaving one place and going to another, which I've definitely felt before. I'm also a huge advocate for immigrants, especially in the political climate we're in right now. It hits hard knowing that some people are experiencing this thirst literally as we speak, while the federal government refuses to help. I see the poem as mapping not just desert geographies and physical borders, but like the inner landscapes of want and survival. All right, so although I could talk about this poem all day, I fear it's time to wrap things up. All in all, For Want of Water by Sasha Pimentel takes us into territories and a setting of drought and delay, of body and boundaries, scarcity and having meaning, aka a lot of juxtaposition in there, through its imagery, metaphor, diction, symbolism, juxtaposition. It prompts us to feel what is often goes unspoken, which is that water is not just physical, but also emotional and spiritual. Thank you so much for joining me in this exploration. This poem has definitely made me view literature in a different light, in a physical light. In the future, I plan on listening differently to the wetness and dryness in the world around me and myself and to other people, and I think you should too. Thank you so much. Have a great day.